Så, välkomna till Österåkers biblioteks livestreaming. Ikväll ska vi få höra Brian Burns berätta och musicera på temat Irländsk vår. Varsågod Brian.
Sylvia och hej allihopa. Ja, vi har bestämt att idag vi ska prata lite om vår irländsk vår och några irländska författare som är faktiskt född i maj. Så att vi ska prata om Colm Tóibín. Och först och främst, jag måste säga Sylvia, jag har allt som vi säger, som jag säger, typ 30 sekunder senare. Så
du kan muta YouTube-videon kanske.
Jag ska försöka fixa det. Vänta nu.
Jag vet, det hände mig första gången jag streamade också. Jag har lärt mig den hårda vägen.
Det har du lärt dig.
Det gör vi alla.
Det är första gången för mig nu, så jag ska kolla. Aha, okej, nu säger jag det. Okej. Jag visste inte att jag hade öppet det, men nu säger jag det faktiskt, att det var öppet.
Jag har varit med om precis samma sak. Jag vet hur det känns.
Okej, så det blir bättre om jag inte har mig själv 2 gånger i rad. Det blir lite för mycket. Så att vi hade bestämt att prata om irländsk vår. Men tänker på 3 irländska författare som är faktiskt född i maj. Och de 3 irländska författare heter Colm Tóibín, Roddy Doyle och Maeve Binchy. Och först och främst, vi tänkte det är väldigt intressant att alla 3, kanske 3 av de mest kända irländska författare är alla född i maj. Och vi tänkte kanske ta in lite musik, originalmusik också, som jag ska spela för ni som vill lyssna. Och beskriva lite grann också om maj och vår från ett irländsk perspektiv, som betyder också att vi har en keltisk perspektiv på det hela. Och jag vet inte, jag såg på Facebook evenemang att det är faktiskt fler människor från utomlands också, så det är inte alla som pratar svenska. Så jag faktiskt jag vet inte riktigt hur mycket jag ska ta på engelska och hur mycket på svenska, men vi kanske kan blanda ihop lite. Så det blir delvis på svenska, delvis på engelska. Och om det är någon som har frågor, ni får gärna ställa frågor i chatten på Facebook eller på YouTube. Och då ska Sylvia förhoppningsvis ha lite koll på läget och skicka vidare till mig.
Jag kommer vara lite teknisk support här.
Jättebra Sylvia, fantastiskt. Så det är premiär för mig att göra det på det sättet. Så vi förhoppningsvis det kommer att funka ganska bra. Jag är helt säker att det kommer att bli jättebra. Så att vi kan kanske börja först med Roddy Doyle. Som blev väldigt känd 1989. Eller 87 faktiskt. Han kom med en genombrott bok och novell och som blev till en jättesuccé, en stor Hollywoodfilm, The Commitments. The Commitments was the story of a group of musicians from Dublin, and at the time it's probably almost 20% unemployment, alltså ungefär 20% arbetslös i Dublin 80-talet. Så det fanns inte mycket jobb för musiker eller för någon överhuvudtaget. So basically, a guy called Jimmy Rabbit, a character, the main protagonist, Jimmy Rabbit, who was a musician, he had the idea to set up a band. And basically, he held auditions in Roddy Doyle's book, The Commitments, in order to put together a band, a soul band, similar to Wilson Pickett, for example, or Motown. So he put together a band, a big band of about 10 or 12 musicians, all from inner city Dublin. And the reason why both the film, well, the book first, obviously, the script for the film, which Roddy Doyle was also involved in, became such a success was because it was perceived to be very authentic. And basically what that means is that prior to Roddy Doyle's writing, there probably wasn't so much literature, at least mainstream literature, or literature that had become so popular worldwide and globally, which is what The Commitments was, a global success. It was the first time literature was sourced and heavily based in Dublin slang, Dublin, the local dialect, the local English that was spoken in Dublin and in Ireland, which was probably not very well known to people who obviously were not from Dublin or from Ireland, or who had traveled to Ireland or Dublin at that stage in the 80s or before. So the success of The Commitments and the success of Roddy Doyle is that in his first 3 books, which is referred to as the Barrystown trilogy, The Commitments, The Snapper, which came 2 years later, and The Van, which all focus on characters from the north side of Dublin City. They used a dialect, they used a language that was very, very colloquial. It was heavy in rhetoric from the local area in Dublin. It was there was a large amount of slang, which for most people outside of Dublin probably wouldn't have been well known, and outside of Ireland probably nobody knew. So there was a new type of English, an Irish English, that was being exposed to international readers for the first time. So a lot of the people who would have read the Barrystown trilogy and then also seen the movies, because there was actually 3 movies made, The Commitments, first The Commitments, then The Snapper and The Van. The Snapper, the second part of the trilogy, focused on the pregnancy of Jimmy's sister or daughter. I'm not quite sure, I can't remember which it was, one of those, who she became pregnant in the book, in the story. And then there was a bit of a mystery about who the father of the child was. So it's actually a very, very funny, very typical Dublin humor, very typical Irish sense of humor. And the story focused on, yeah, like I said, the mystery of the father of Sharon's child, but also showed very graphically and clearly the type of language that was spoken. And Roddy Doyle has really, in his books, managed to capture, I guess, the colorful nature of the language that is used in Irish English, especially, and of course the English that is used in Dublin, locally in Dublin, in Ireland, the capital city of Ireland. So, and the north side of Dublin, which even more specifically Kilbarrack, which is where Roddy Doyle comes from. And at the time of those first 3 novels, Roddy Doyle, who was already having huge success, was a school teacher. So he was actually still working as a teacher in school at a time where his books were being published worldwide. His books were being made into movies that were having huge success globally. So much so that the actor Andrew Strong, who played the singer of the Commitments, the band in the first movie, he put a bet on with because of course they released the soundtrack of all the songs and the music that was in the movie, and he put a bet on either with the producers of the movie or the producers of the album that was released, the soundtrack, that they would sell, it would be gold or a platinum disc. He put a bet on with the owner that if it did become a gold or platinum success in terms of sales, that he wanted to have it was either a Ferrari or a Porsche. I can't remember which. And he actually got the car. He got the Porsche or the Ferrari, whichever it was, as a result of the sales of that and success of that movie and the soundtrack of the movie. Mustang Sally being a huge hit from the album, from the soundtrack. So basically, moving on then from the Commitments and the Snapper, the third book, The Van, tells the story of a little bit more, again, back to the problem of employment or unemployment in Ireland and in Dublin specifically, where the two main protagonists lose their jobs, lose their employment, and they end up buying a second-hand fish and chip van and making a business between the two of them in terms of selling fish and chips. So again, a lot of black comedy, black humor, very, very typical language of Dublin and Ireland at the time. And that was also critically and a commercial success. So after the Barrystown trilogy, Roddy Doyle then decided that he was going to become a full-time writer, which is amazing that it took that long or that amount of success, but that's what happened. He basically became a full-time writer. He gave up his job as a teacher. This would have been in the mid-90s, maybe 92, 93. And then in 93, he wrote a book called Paddy Clark, Ha Ha. And within a year or two of becoming a full-time writer, Roddy Doyle actually won the Man Booker Prize. So the Booker Prize, which is one of the best-known literary prizes in the world of literature, he won it for that particular story, which told the main protagonist was a 10-year-old boy from Dublin. And it's set in the 60s, I think in late 60s, 68 maybe. So Paddy Clark is this young boy who basically gives the reader this perspective of Dublin and Ireland in the late 60s through the eyes of a 10-year-old boy. And the language that was used, the literature, again, that was used in that story, in that novel by Roddy Doyle was again, another step up in terms of the quality of the literature, the quality of the writing, I should say. Critically, obviously, winning the Booker Prize, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, along with the Pulitzer Prize in terms of literature. So a really incredible start to his writing career. Having written or published the Commitments in, I think, 87, 88. So within 5 years, he had published 4 books that had all been commercial and critical successes. And he topped that then by winning the Booker Prize for Paddy Clark. So Roddy Doyle, born in May in Kilbarra, born in Dublin in Ireland, was the first writer which we said we would have a look at for this Irländsk vår special for Österåker Bibliotek. If you have any questions that I can answer, or if we can follow up, please feel free to write them in the chat, or feel free to put them on Facebook chat or on the YouTube stream for Österåker Bibliotek. And Sylvia, I'm sure, will help with the passing on of those questions and the follow-up of those questions. So then we'll take, moving on from Roddy Doyle, we'll take a look at, before we take a piece of music, I guess we'll have a look at another Irish writer that was born in May in Ireland, actually in the southeast of Ireland, quite close to where my mother comes from, in County Wexford, is a writer by the name of Colm Tóibín. And Colm Tóibín is, without doubt, one of the most critically acclaimed writers that we have at the moment in Ireland. He is recognized globally as being somebody who has a poetic flair when it comes to his style of writing. He focus, of course, on Irish issues, Irish topics. The town where he grew up in, Enniscorthy in County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland, which he also included in his novel Brooklyn, which was then made into a Hollywood movie with with an Irish actress by the name of Saoirse Ronan, depicts a very common theme for a lot of Irish writers and musicians and poets, in that it focuses and illustrates the topic of emigration, which is a reoccurring theme, of course, for a lot of Irish writers, musicians, poets, and of course the ordinary working man or woman who has to leave the country to go and find work in different jobs and in different countries, and to be able to expand their horizons, I suppose, as well. So Colm Tóibín has actually written quite a few novels focusing on those types of topics. He also is probably one of the first openly homosexual writers and in Irish literature. He has spoken about his journey being homosexual in rural Ireland very eloquently. I met him in Stockholm 5-6 years ago. He came to Stockholm to give a reading and talk about a book that that was being published at the time, and very, very, very honest and very open about the challenges that a person in a rural setting in Ireland in those times faced. He, unlike Roddy Doyle, who was a teacher, Colm Tóibín actually started life as a journalist. He studied, I think, in UCD, and then he went on to become a journalist at first the McGill magazine. And McGill was a very famous publication in Ireland at that time, especially in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Would have been one of the more popular magazines. It was a kind of a mix of all different topical issues, as well as literature and various cultural events. So essentially, Colm Tóibín, then he moved on from, he wrote various books, including he wrote an interesting, I suppose, an interpretation or perspective on Henry James called The Master, which is also a very good read. And he basically gives a very interesting perspective and insight into Henry, obviously his interpretation of Henry James in the novel The Master, which is well worth a read. And from there, he's been on the Booker shortlist, I'm sure, at least 4 or 5 times with various novels that he's written. He is currently, I think, a chancellor in the University of Liverpool. So he's connected to Liverpool University. And yeah, I mean, Colm Tóibín, like I said, will probably at the moment would probably be in terms of contemporary Irish writers, would be at, if not the top, the very, very close to the top of the list in terms of Irish contemporary writers, in terms of his interpretation of all topics, both related to Ireland and I guess, topics outside of Ireland from an Irish perspective. So he's another Irish writer that we discovered was born in the month of May. So at this stage, we've had a look at 2 writers. So what we'll do now is we'll take a piece of music, because Sylvia asked if it would be possible to play a little bit of music as well. So vi ska ta en låt. Nu har jag pratat ganska mycket på engelska, så vi tar det på svenska. Och jag kommer faktiskt spela en ny låt som jag har skrivit själv på svenska. Jag blev, precis som alla andra människor, väldigt påverkad av det hela hej Sylvia, omständigheter med tanke på coronakrisen och i princip så många människor faktiskt som har förlorat någon släkt eller en nära och kära. Så att jag skrev en låt som jag kommer att spela nu, och låten heter Jag saknar dig, och jag vet inte hur det ska funka här, ja, det kan inte gå bra här. Så. Och jag hoppas med ljud att det... Jag tänder ett ljus och jag tänker på dig, min kära vän, som kärleksträd. Jag har dig nu och din ord med lej. Jag saknar dig nu för all evighet. Jag känner din kram på västra vind. Havets luft och dödlighet framför mig och bakom mig. Jag saknar dig nu för all evighet. Det känns som du gick just för en stund, men aldrig kom hem en minneslund. Du är säkert i himlen och vet nu min vän, jag saknar dig nu för all evighet. Jag tänder ett ljus och jag tänker på dig, min kära vän, som kärleksträd. Jag har dig nu och din nåd med lej. Jag saknar dig nu för all evighet. Jag saknar dig nu för all evighet. So that was a world premiere of Jag saknar dig. It's actually I've taken an all Irish melody called "Black Is the Color" and written a Swedish text, a Swedish lyric, which is a first for me. But I thought, okay, I'm living in Sweden, making my life in Sweden. I might as well write a Swedish song. So there we go. That was Jag saknar dig, world premiere, just for you people out there.
Tack så mycket, Brian. Tack.
Varsågod. Varsågod, Sylvia. Okay, let's move on. And we discovered that a third writer, Irish writer, that celebrates their birthday or celebrated their birthday in May, was probably one of the most famous Irish writers of the 20th century, and that was Maeve Binchy. Of the three writers that we were talking about, that Irish writers born in May, she unfortunately is the only one that's no longer with us. She passed on in 2012. She was born, I think, just before the war, 1939 or something, in Dublin. So we went with Roddy Doyle from Dublin to Wexford with Colm Tóibín, and now we go back to Dublin with Maeve Binchy. And actually, Maeve Binchy lived and grew up in a place called Dalkey, which is not even 15-20 minutes from where I grew up in Bray, in Wicklow in Ireland. So if you took the train, there's a very nice train, a bit like the Roslagsbanan that goes from Stockholm to Orkesberga. There's a really nice train journey called the Dart, which goes from Dublin city centre down to Greystones in Wicklow. And Maeve Binchy's beautiful village of Dalkey is on the. It's called Heaven's Reflex. It's basically the train travels through the south side of Dublin city, and then it passes through Dalkey, this beautiful village where Maeve Binchy came from, and then it goes through a tunnel and it comes out literally right on the Irish Sea. So you're in the train looking down on the Irish Sea and all the water, and across this massive bay you can see the Wicklow Hills, and you can see County Wicklow, and a really beautiful part of the world, and called Heaven's Reflex. And some people think it bears a resemblance to the Bay of Naples in Italy, and I've been to the Bay of Naples in Italy, and there is definitely some kind of a similarity in the layout. So this is where Maeve Binchy grew up, and of course Maeve Binchy being the only female writer we're going to have a look at of the three she was born. I think she was born quite close to Colm Tóibín. I think they were both born towards the end of the month, the 28th of May and 30th of May. Roddy Doyle, I think, was towards the start of May, near my son's birthday on the 7th. My son Connor was born on the 7th of May. I think Roddy Doyle was the day after, on the 8th of May. So Maeve Binchy being the only woman or lady, female writer that we're going to talk about here today, she really broke a lot of ground, not only as a female writer, but as a writer at all, in terms of the success, the global success that she had. Her writing career began in a very interesting way. She basically traveled to the kibbutz in Israel. It was kind of a common thing. I don't know if it was a common thing to do, but I do remember when I grew up in Ireland that there were people who wanted to travel to Israel. There's a very interesting and long story about how I was on my way to work in the kibbutz in Israel, and I ended up falling in love, and I didn't manage to get past Italy. I made it as far as Venice, and then my journey went in a different direction. But Maeve Binchy managed to make it to the kibbutz in Israel, and the kibbutz was like this kind of a social structure that was set up for farming, for working, for art crafts, for making various artifacts from wood and what have you. A lot of manual labor, especially, I suppose, for not only for the foreign people who would come and work there. Generally, it was kind of a place where people went to work for. It was never normally a short time. It was normally for a few months at a time. So Maeve Binchy, when she was in the kibbutz in Israel, plucking hens or growing vegetables or whatever she was doing, she was actually writing letters home to her family in Ireland, of course, at the time. And this would have been probably in the 50s, mid 50s. And her father, who was so impressed by her writing, he actually did something very interesting. He decided to cut off the top of the letter, which said, dear father, or what have you. And he sent the texts to local newspapers in Ireland, in Dublin. The Irish Independent, I think, was the paper he sent the letters to. And the letters were actually printed. So I'm not sure if Maeve Binchy knew that at the time when she was in Israel. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, I don't know. Unfortunately, I didn't meet her personally, so I couldn't ask her. But the letters were actually published, printed in the Irish Independent, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Ireland at the time, and still is. And on returning from Israel, Maeve Binchy began to work as a journalist in probably, I guess, in the Irish Times or the Irish Independent. But then she moved on to the Irish Times. And worked as a journalist. And she then went on to writing novels. And her first, I suppose, her first novel, Light a Penny Candle, was hugely successful. One of the most successful debut novels by a writer ever, from what I understand. I think she made, I don't know how much money she made, but there was huge figures at the time in terms of the publishing deals that Light a Penny Candle received, first in English for the American market, and then for the European market, it was translated into French, and so within the space of launching or publishing her first novel, Maeve Binchy was already an internationally well-known and critically acclaimed writer. So she continued on from there. I think most people in Ireland would consider Maeve Binchy somebody who, maybe similar to Colm Tóibín, in the sense that she took rural settings, or she took a community or a social grouping in Ireland, and she managed to elaborate in words both the language that the people used in the particular narrative, but also managed to describe the area, describe the setting of Ireland in that particular location in such a way that it made it accessible for especially readers outside Ireland, because of course Ireland would have been an incredibly important market for literature, in the sense that it managed to give writers like Roddy Doyle, Colm Tóibín, Maeve Binchy a foothold and an opportunity to develop as writers. But of course, it's a relatively small country, and the fantastic thing about the English or British presence in Ireland, and we won't get into that today, but one of the things they did leave behind was the English language. So the opportunity for writers like Roddy Doyle and Colm Tóibín and Maeve Binchy was that because they were writing in English, it meant that their novels were instantly accessible and available to English-speaking markets. And of course, the largest English-speaking markets, one of them was across the Irish Sea in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain. And then the other direction, across the Atlantic Ocean, you had America, United States of America, and North America, including Canada. So Maeve Binchy was probably the first writer, Irish writer, contemporary writer at least, to really break all kinds of records in terms of book sales, and of course then everything else that goes with that. So I think Maeve Binchy's books have sold over 40 million, somewhere that's somewhere around that number, 40 million copies worldwide, which is a huge number, of course. She published novels like Circle of Friends, which became a Hollywood movie, which was actually, funnily enough, shot down. I'm pretty sure it was shot down in Wexford, not so far from where Colm Tóibín comes from. And she essentially she managed to put a certain type of literature, Irish literature, really on a world stage. And you know, I think it's fair to say that writers that came after her, like Cecilia Ahern, writers like that, you know, have a lot to thank Maeve Binchy for, because Maeve Binchy probably created the awareness of this type of literature, and also, of course, from a female writer. So a lot of the Irish female writers, for example, Cecilia Ahern, just to mention one, you know, they would have really had a lot of doors open for them, thanks to the writing and the books and the novels and success, of course, of Maeve Binchy. Another novel that was commercially a huge success was Tara Road. And, you know, the success of Maeve Binchy, I think, was, again, in creating a setting and personalities in those settings that really, you know, made it possible for people. It didn't matter if you were in New York or in Chicago or California or London or Stockholm or whatever. She managed, with her language, with her writing, to create a very kind of an intimate feel to the characters and to the settings. So you really had the feeling when you read a Maeve Binchy text or novel that you had been to the place, that you had met those people, those characters. So that accessibility that she achieved in through her writing was something that would then be, I don't want to use the word reproduced, but it was something that would become quite common in popular novel writing, and of course, you know, hugely successful writers and especially female writers that came from Ireland afterwards, you know, would have some kind of similar traits when it came to this type of this style of writing. So I think Maeve Binchy was probably the one writer in the 20th century Irish literature world who really managed to create a you know, huge waves in and also a genre of writing that possibly was not so maybe recognized or associated with Ireland beforehand, possibly, because you have to remember that in terms of Irish literature and Irish writers, there's always been a kind of a acknowledgement that Ireland has had incredibly skilled and successful writers and poets, you know, in a classical sense, going back to, of course, I mean, writers like you know, W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, the whole way back to Jonathan Swift. So there was a long tradition of classical writers in the English language coming from Ireland. But I think Maeve Binchy was probably in the 20th century, if not the most successful writer. She was definitely one of the most successful Irish writers to come out of the country in the 20th century. So so she was another writer that we thought it was actually interesting that we discovered that those three writers were all born in the month of May. And just to kind of finish up today, the whole, I suppose, logic behind what we were trying to do with this particular presentation, apart from obviously putting a bit of a spotlight on some Irish writers and Irish writing, maybe known or maybe not so well known in Sweden and in Österåker. Hopefully now this will give you a little bit of a curiosity to go and check out some of those writers and some of those novels, because they're incredibly fantastic. I mean, I've read especially Paddy Clark, Haha, I can strongly recommend, by Roddy Doyle. That's a fantastic book, and gives you a real insight into Irish language and Irish English, and also the setting that is Dublin. And of course, the Maeve Binchy novels are a global phenomenon, so it should be easy to find, I'm sure, in Österåker's library, and at least one or two copies, I would guess.
Definitely. Yes.
Definitely.
We have them. Yes, we do. Please come and come out.
So if you drop by the Österåker library, then you will have a selection of some of those books from Irish writers, and I can strongly recommend them. Yeah, just I guess a little bit of an Irish perspective on because we spoke about the Irländsk vår and the Irish spring. And I was kind of thinking about, I suppose a little combination as well of when I was, going through the various novels and the list of literature that these fantastic writers had. I got thinking, of course, like with Maeve Binchy, when I saw the title and thought about the book Circle of Friends, I started to think a little bit about spring, and going back to Celtic times in Ireland, spring was actually kind of similar, I suppose, in some ways to Sweden. It was a huge festival, a pagan festival called Beltane, which was basically the celebration of the start of the summer period of the year, or the light period of the year. It was normally celebrated, the festival of Beltane was normally celebrated between the spring equinox and midsummer. But as I said, it was normally a period of the year where farmers especially would prepare their fields and prepare the lands, and then there would be a kind of a celebration with bonfires. Obviously, you would imagine similar to Germany, where they have the Osterfeuer, where they would take any kind of debris or wood or brambles or that they had cleaned out of the fields to let the animals to come into the fields to graze. They would be all brought together, and they would light a big fire, and then there would be a celebration and music. So Beltane and the festival of Beltane is actually a very, very important Celtic festival in Ireland and Scotland as well, of course. And so much so, actually, that in Irish, in Gaelic, the month of May is actually called Beltane. So the Irish for May is Beltane, which shows you kind of how the importance and significance of the festival, and that was actually incorporated into the Irish language as the naming of this particular month of May. So I suppose thinking of the celebration and thinking about the circle of friends, and again the circle of how the year we go through the various festivals and the various periods of the year. Now, thankfully, we're coming from a long dark winter in Corona times. In case the darkness wasn't enough, we also went through a global pandemic, but thankfully, we are now coming into the lighter part of the year, to the summer. And here with today, we've had incredible weather. We've had 20, 22 degrees and sun, blue skies here for the last few days. So it really does feel like the winter and the dark period of the year is coming to an end. And we're going to now start moving into the summer and the bright period and the positive period. And hopefully we'll be able to meet our friends and meet our family again very, very soon. I know in Ireland, for example, this was the first week where people were actually allowed to go out and meet their family and friends again. And so that's something to take advantage of. So what I decided to do for the final piece of music and for a song that to close up today, I decided to do a song I wrote called Soulmates. And basically, I'd like to dedicate the song to all the family and friends, both of mine personally, that I haven't seen for such a long time because of the corona crisis, both in Sweden and of course in Ireland and Germany and France and America and other places as well. But hopefully we'll all see each other soon. So thanks very much for listening today. And if you have any questions, please send on the questions through the chat or directly to the library, and we'll of course answer those questions. So we'll finish up today with a song called Soulmates. And it goes something like this. When I met you, November, we laughed and we talked about how the magic spark in the dark, light in the night, spirits from afar, 1,000 years or more. Soulmates with soul traits. Steaming tea, chocolate, the perfume, the air, the words that run like the wind. And a train, spark in the dark, light in the night, spirits from afar, 1,000 years or more. Soulmates. And looking back, it's funny what we did say, convinced each other of our destiny. Butterflies, starlight, magic on the wind. Soulmates. Ba-da-da-da-da, 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 oh, 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 yeah. Ba-da-da-da-da, 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 whoa, oh, oh. Even mountains leave their shadows. The most joyous smile hides the pain within. And the snow covers the ice. And so it goes. With the sun that blinds out the light. Soulmates. And so it goes. With the sun that blinds out the light. soulmates. Ba-da-da-da-da. 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 Whoa, oh, 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 yeah. Ba-da-da-da-da. 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 Whoa, oh, 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 yeah. Ba-da-da-da-da. 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 Whoa, oh, 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 yeah. Ba-da-da-da-da. 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 Whoa, oh, 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 oh. Tack så mycket! Tack Sylvia! And everybody else I can't see. That was fantastic. Tack så mycket Sylvia, det var jättetrevligt. Jag hoppas att man hörde någonting tekniskt, att det gick bra för dig. Ja.
Det gick bra. Jag har fått en fråga nu.
Okej.
The three authors are all very yet quite different in genre. Would you say that the reader can find three different kinds of Ireland in them? Or would you describe their differences?
That's a really good question. And I would say, yeah, I would agree. Three very different styles of writing. For me personally, I think Roddy Doyle is probably the most, I mean, if you talk about this urban style, and especially the use of slang, Irish, English, a dialect that is really specific, especially those 4 novels that I spoke about, they really do use a style of writing that is very typical for that part of Dublin, especially Northside Dublin. And at that period of time, of course, because now we're talking, you know, a few years ago. But I would say Maeve Binchy and Colm Tóibín both probably, if I may say that without any disrespect to Roddy Doyle, I would say a more cryptic style of writing, probably a more, in some ways, a more advanced technique when it came to writing. So maybe a bit more of a challenge to read. Maybe Roddy Doyle and Maeve Binchy both might be a little bit easier to read or more accessible to read, let's say, especially if English is not your first language, because of course I'm keeping in mind that, you know, I'm in Sweden and jag vet precis hur det är. Jag pluggar på svenska just nu och det är inte lätt att läsa akademisk eller avancerat text på främspråk, så jag är väldigt medveten om det. So it can be sometimes quite difficult for a non-native speaker to access, because of course there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of reading between the lines when it comes to reading literature, and especially Colm Tóibín. Me personally, I think there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of there's a much more cryptic sense of narrative when it comes to Colm Tóibín's writing, where possibly Maeve Binchy, similar to Roddy Doyle, is probably more accessible, a little bit easier to read in some ways, but in contrast to Roddy Doyle, at least in my knowledge of Maeve Binchy's work, probably a little bit more rural in terms of the settings and the locations and what have you. But yeah, very good question, and I think, and yeah, I would agree. I think 3 writers who expose 3 different sides of Ireland. That you know, I think it would probably be an interesting thing to do would be to kind of read a novel each, maybe over the summer. I've got my books in for my summer reading out at the cabin, and I think, you know, if you read literature by different writers within a short space of time, or as short as possible, it can be quite interesting sometimes to see the different styles, even though they come from the same country like Ireland. It can be interesting to see the different perspectives and the different styles, and of course there are, you know, possibly, you know, slightly different periods depending on what you read. Both Roddy Doyle and Colm Tóibín are still writing and still publishing work, so you can, you know, you can still access novels and work publications from Colm Tóibín and Roddy Doyle that have been released very recently. Although I know Roddy Doyle is also he's doing theater and script work for theater and different things. So he's kind of diversified maybe in that sense. I would agree. I would say three writers who give very different perspectives in Ireland and also use, of course, the language, the Irish English language, in their own unique way and from their own perspective. Any more questions, or can I go and get my dinner?
Well, that was great so far. So yeah, maybe I had a question about Dublin sociolect that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between North and South there?
Again, a good question. I mean, we have, I remember once a very famous TV presenter called Gay Byrne. He actually was the presenter of the longest running talk show in television history. It's still running, still every Friday night on Irish television. And he spoke about the difference, because in the middle of Dublin city, you have the River Liffey, and it really does divide the city in two, on the north side and the south side. And we've been talking about Roddy Doyle and the Commitments and the Snapper in the Van and all of those novels. I mean, Roddy Doyle was born on the north side of Dublin. He's worked his whole life on the north side of Dublin. I don't think he's moved from there. I think he's still, and a lot of people on the north side, as this famous television presenter once said, they could not name you two streets on the south side of the river, and vice versa. And actually, there's a lot of people on the south side of the river, South Dublin, that have never been on the north side of Dublin, and vice versa. So I'm not sure how common that is, and especially in a capital city, to have, because of course we have like the Thames River in London, the Seine in Paris, so we do have, of course, like these capital cities and cities where you have a river as a boundary, as a natural boundary, and of course those types of boundaries, it's incredible the impact they have on language. So you can, of course, have a sense of identity, because of course language is identity, and a sense of identity that develops in a specific location, whether it be on the north side of Dublin, as exposed by Roddy Doyle. But there are words and phrases on the north side, used in the English on the north side of Dublin, that are not used on the south side. So if somebody used a phrase or a word similar to Roddy Doyle has used in those novels, it wouldn't be every word and phrase that I would, because I grew up, I would say the most extreme part of South Dublin, South County Dublin, or North Wicklow, which is the next county down the coast, the east coast of Ireland. So, there would have been words and phrases also that we used in South Dublin, or North Wicklow, that they would not know and would not use on the north side of Dublin. So even though it's only 45 minutes on a train or something like that, or to drive in a car, it's not far. Dublin's not a big city. It's quite spread out, but it's not big in the sense of the actual city itself. So it's really fascinating how you can go from one part of the city or one side of the city. But of course, you do see something similar in Stockholm. You have a certain type of a dialect on Söder. Östermalmska, I suppose, is another type of a dialect that they use in that part of the city. The flashy part, of fashionable part of the city, whatever you want to call it. So, and it's interesting in the sense in Stockholm that we're talking about islands. There's a lot. Again, we have this natural boundary of water, which separates one part of the city to another. and then the language develops its own kind of a, you know, unique kind of a style, and of course, which is part of the identity of that particular part of the city. And I think Roddy Doyle's success in taking a relatively local dialect in the north side of Dublin City and being able to write, you know, novels that were hugely successful all over the world, and then into movies that were, you know, I mean, I think before Roddy Doyle started to write those novels, I don't think many people would have thought that you could write in that type of language and then produce a Hollywood movie using that type of language and have such a massive commercial success. But it just showed how interesting people thought that was, you know, because of course, if you come from Sweden or if you come from Germany or a country that doesn't use English as a first language, then we have a kind of perception that, you know, it's English, you know, everything is English, you know. And of course we recognize maybe, yeah, the English in Britain is probably a bit different to the English in America, but of course it's still English. And of course it's not. I mean, it's, you have dialects that have really, you know, huge implications in terms of the identity of the people, and give the people a sense of belonging. You know, this is where we come from. You know, so if you use a certain phrase or certain types of words, then people know, okay, then you come from, you know, whether it's the Bronx in New York, or you come from, you know, South California as opposed to LA or North California, or, you know, like we said in Stockholm, you know, if you speak Swedish in a certain way, then that will show whether you come from, you know, Södermalm or from Östermalm or a different part of the city. So that type of, you know, we see that in different places where boundaries, whether it's train tracks, as Bruce Springsteen, you know, wrote and sang about, or like obviously man-made boundaries like walls or train tracks, but we also have natural boundaries like, you know, water, especially rivers or lakes, or of course seas and oceans, which really allows the language to develop in its own way over a period of time, which is interesting. For me, who likes languages.
We love languages. Yeah. Wow, that was very interesting. So tiden går, time runs when we're having fun.
Ja, så är det i livet. Vad ska du göra på helgen nu? Det är Kristi himmel och lång helg. Har du någonting?
Jag ska njuta av det vackra vädret så länge det går. Det är det bästa man kan göra just nu.
Ja, det ska man verkligen göra, därför att det är verkligen så fint ut. Jag åkte motorcykeln idag, det var faktiskt ganska varmt i solen. Så man ska njuta av det.
Ja, det hoppas jag alla gör just nu. Ja. Och framöver. Och tack så jättemycket, Brian.
Varsågod, Sylvia. It was my pleasure.
Yes. Och tack alla som har lyssnat.
Tack så mycket till alla.
Vi ses.
Vi ses. Sköt er med. Ha det bra. Hej hej.